2 o'clock classes. Our speaker is Chris Markiewicz. He received his PhD in 2015 from the University of Chicago. He spent 2 years at Oxford as a research fellow, and he is now a lecturer at the University of Birmingham in the UK. His dissertation manuscript, which is now his book manuscript, is focused on the crisis of kingship in the Ottoman Empire. It's concerned with the ways in which Persian political thought and the legacy of the Timurids helps to shape Ottoman ideas about sovereignty in the late 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century. He's interested in the ways in which Ottoman political thought fits into the broader world of Islamic political thought. He does his research in Ottoman, in Persian, and in Arabic. The book manuscript, when we read it, before inviting him, was submitted to Cambridge University Press. It now has 2 favorable readings from Cambridge University Press and has moved along in the direction of publication there. Chris is also the author of a number of articles. I should mention his article, A History of Science, which is about debates about history at the end of the 15th century in the Islamic world, which appeared in the Journal of Early Modern History, and his article on trends and trajectories in Ottoman history, which is forthcoming this year in Past and Present. He's going to speak today about Ottoman vocabulary of sovereignty. Chris, all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Larry, and more generally, I'd like to thank the committee and sort of all of the people that I've met with in the last day. It's been really enjoyable, and I've been grateful to sort of share a little bit about my work and learn a little bit about the 2 departments, history and MEIS. But I better sort of get started right away. I mean, today I want to talk about the Ottoman vocabulary of sovereignty at the dawn of empire, and I think I'll start with reference to a kind of anecdote. So, in the late spring of 1514, for the 3rd time in 40 years, the main Ottoman army departed from Constantinople to confront a major Muslim power to the east. The campaign culminated in late August at the Battle of Chaldiran and an Ottoman victory over the Safavid forces of Shah Ismail, the teenage Sufi master, messianic figure, and emperor of Iran. In broad terms, the confrontation checked the Safavid threat to the Ottomans for several decades and initiated a rapid trajectory of eastward conquest that led to the incorporation of present-day Eastern Anatolia, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. Yet more immediately, in the days following the battle, the Ottoman Sultan Selim moved to capitalize on the disarray of the defeated enemy and ordered his army to advance on the Safavid capital of Tabriz, with the aim of adding western Iran to Ottoman domains. To that end, Selim ordered a flying column of 500 troops to rush to Tabriz and secure the city. Among the members of this advance party was an aging scholar and Persian emigre named Idris Bidlisi. No doubt, Bidlisi's profile and experience were judged invaluable to Selim. After all, as a respected Persian emigre scholar and statesman, Bidlisi was well positioned to begin the work of persuading the city's urban notables of the justice of Ottoman rule. The advance party moved urgently in order to arrive in the city by Friday, in time for the congregational prayers that would see the populace assemble en masse. The timing was crucial because it afforded Bidlisi the opportunity to offer the Friday sermon in the name of the city's new ruler, the Ottoman Sultan Selim. A few years later, Bidlisi, in a few lines of poetry, recalled his excitement at his homecoming and noted how he focused his sermon on explaining the qualities and attributes of Selim, al-Qab sultan. In this manner, the mission of the advanced party was ideological as well as practical. In addition to securing the city from the retreating Safavid forces, the party, and especially Bidlisi, was tasked with beginning the more difficult work of persuading the newly conquered population of the suitability and desirability of Ottoman rule. So what then were these qualities and attributes that Bidlisi expounded upon? In this particular instance, he's rather, actually uncharacteristically, silent. And yet, more broadly, his experiences and work for the Ottomans, like a number of similar contemporary Persian emigres, was central to the transformation of Ottoman discourses on rule at a critical juncture in the Sultanate's history. In modern historiography, the impact and role of these emigres has been mostly overlooked because they do not fit comfortably within the basic frameworks in which Ottoman sovereignty has been studied. In fact, most modern scholarship has approached the development and trajectory of Ottoman sovereignty during the 15th and 16th centuries as a mostly insular phenomenon. That is to say, as a phenomenon largely isolated from a broader contemporaneous currents within Islamic lands. And so, through a reliance on a few literary sources or a few archival records produced in Turkish in the 15th century, modern historians have emphasized the Sultan's identity as preeminent warrior of the faith. And here's a letter in the Topkapi Palace from the late 15th century in which Gaza, the concept of war in the faith, is mentioned several times. Here, the geographic location of the early Sultanate, at the extremity of Islamic lands, in places lightly Islamicized, helped nurture an image of the Ottoman sultans as brave warriors in the faith. To be sure, over the first 200 years of its existence, Ottoman sultans had personally led raids and effected conquests of non-Muslim territory, most notably in the Balkans, that garnered enormous prestige for the dynasty. Such activities, referred to alternatively as gaza or jihad, produced the greatest expansion of Islamic lands in the 14th and 15th centuries. And in this respect, such a distinguishing attribute, that is to say Ottoman rulers as sultans of gazis, can be said without exaggeration to constitute both the raison d'etre of the early Sultanate as well as a compelling component of its legitimating ideology. In addition to Gaza, Turkish chronicles produced in the late 15th century suggest that two other discourses were developed. These discourses emphasized Ottoman descent from a prominent Turkic lineage, namely Oğuz Khan. And here's a passage from an early 16th century chronicle which traces Osman here going backwards to Oğuz Khan many generations earlier. As a sort of third point, such discourses also emphasized inheritance of political authority from the stable and fondly remembered rule of the Seljuks in the 12th and 13th centuries. In this sense, they also clearly emerged from a 14th century Anatolian context, in which competing Turkmen principalities, among which the Ottomans numbered, jockeyed for position within a fragmented and fluid post-Seljuk political landscape. These three aspects then, Gaza, identity, Oghuz, lineage, and Seljuk inheritance, have in large measure been accepted by modern scholarship as the salient features of Ottoman sovereignty in the 15th century, in part because they are so clearly reflected in the few extant Turkish sources of the period. Yet even if such sources were prominent in this Balkan and Anatolian context, they cannot have been of seminal importance for Tbilisi's more immediate purposes in Tabriz in 1514. The reason for this is that these discourses, construed as they were for the relatively isolated, remote landscape of the Balkans and Anatolia, would not have resonated with the Persian urban classes that he addressed that Friday. In fact, the problem had nagged at the Ottomans since the latter decades of the 15th century. For instance, and I'll return to this letter, in 1473, in the build-up before the Ottoman War with the Akkoyunlu Sultanate of Western Iran, one prominent Akkoyunlu commander sent a letter to an Ottoman counterpart, and that's this letter, that acknowledged the Ottoman reputation for Gaza and suggested that such efforts would be best exercised against unbelievers in the Balkans, and not, as he anticipated, against fellow Muslims. In other words, Gaza was useless as a legitimating component of Ottoman expansion eastward against other Muslim powers. In similar ways, Oghuz lineage and Seljuk inheritance were developed in and for Anatolia. They could not have had been effective in places such as Tabriz, Damascus, or Cairo, all places that the Ottomans are arriving to in the 16th century. Certainly during this period, between 1470 and approximately 1520, the geopolitical contours of West Asia were transformed dramatically. In the final quarter of the 15th century, 4 major polities offered a modicum of stability in a century rife with political fragmentation. And these were the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, the Ottomans in the Balkans and Anatolia, the Aquyunlu Sultanate in western Iran, and the Timurids in eastern Iran. By the second decade of the 16th century, the map would be completely transformed. The Safavids would displace the Aquyunlu and the Timurids, and the Ottomans would displace the Mamluks in turn. Significantly, of the 4 late 15th century polities, only the Ottomans would remain into the 16th century. When historians have examined expressions of Ottoman sovereignty in this new context, they have emphasized the very broad, in fact universal terms in which it is conceived. Earlier generations pointed to occasional references of 16th century sultans as caliphs to suggest that the Ottomans claimed the mantle of Abbasid leadership in the decades after they came to rule in Egypt and Syria and places central to Islamic history. Yet this conception of Ottomans as juridically defined caliphs is unconvincing. I mean, there's simply too few references during the period, and the discourse is really not sustained for any long period of time. More convincing, precisely because it is so pervasive across the widest array of sources, is a conception of Ottoman sovereignty in universal terms that emphasizes a cosmically and sacrally ordained, even messianic claim to universal rule. In this pivot towards sovereignty in the grandest of cosmological terms, the Ottomans were not alone in the 16th century. Indeed, in this century, Muslim rulers of the largest empires of West and South Asia, so I'm referring to the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, but also to some extent the Uzbeks, all embraced this new vocabulary of sovereignty. To be sure, in all cases, the traditional nomenclature remained. The Ottoman Sultan, the Safavid Shah, and the Mughal Padishah still frequently refer to themselves by titles with long histories in Islamic lands. Yet in addition to these traditional titles of sovereign authority, recent historians working on these empires have noted frequent and prominent reference to alternative titles and claims. So in addition to these traditional terms, these emperors were proclaimed Sahib Quran, the Lord of the Auspicious Conjunction, or Mujaddid, the Centennial Renewer of the Faith, or Khalifa-i Ilahi, the Vicegerent of God, and occasionally Mahdi Akhir Zaman, so the reference to the Muslim harbinger of the end time. To explain the preponderance of this vocabulary, modern historians have pointed to the significant cosmic, sacral, or millenarian overtones of these titles, and set them in relation to broader processes of heightened apocalyptic foreboding in the 16th century. In most cases, the new titles grounded their claims to authority in cosmological doctrines that anticipated the ordination of one ruler, one individual, to usher in a new era of universal justice, order, and peace. The claims were potent in the 16th century because they effectively articulated the aspirations of the 3 universal empires. And they were plausible because in the approach of the Hijri year 1000, a year corresponding with 1591 of the Common Era, Muslim societies were primed and charged for great changes in the near future. But these developments and the contrasts that they suggest with earlier forms of Ottoman sovereignty, so referring to the 15th century again, necessarily raise a set of questions. How exactly can we explain this Ottoman shift from the narrow, limited terms of the 15th century to the expansive claims of the new vocabulary of the 16th? More broadly, did this relatively specific vocabulary, how did this relatively specific vocabulary come to be embraced across such a wide expanse within such a short time? Who were its key components, and how did they successfully argue for its use as a major component of political ideology. In addressing these questions, the life and work of Tbilisi and like-minded Persian émigrés are in fact critical. But before I turn to them, I'd like to say a few things about the broader processes that rendered their work so important. In large measure, I see the three empires embracing the new vocabulary for two interrelated reasons. The first concerns the shared legacy of Timur among the three empires. In a broad sense, the political thought that underpinned this new vocabulary had its origins in the career of Timur, was developed through the competing claims of his descendants, and eventually adapted to courts throughout Islamic lands over the course of the 15th century. In this sense, the new vocabulary is not solely a 16th century phenomenon, but the consequence of a longer trajectory that gathered steam over a course of about 100 years or more. The second reason concerns a more general process of the movement of men, mostly men, and ideas in Islamic lands during this period. In many instances, the adaptation of the Timurid conception of rule can be traced specifically through the movement of scholars, statesmen, and secretaries from one court to another, and observed in the application of this specific vocabulary by these itinerant men to ever-widening political contexts. To begin with, though, we should consider how and why these titles appealed so broadly among rulers in the 15th and 16th centuries. They all appealed because they responded effectively to an ideological crisis of rule during this period. The crisis concerned the difficulty of articulating a legitimate and widely acknowledged basis for universal sovereignty in Islamic lands. This crisis was precipitated by two major earlier events. The first was the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate to the Mongols in 1258, an event which brought to an end the conceptual unity of Islamic lands under a single caliph, whose qualities were clearly defined through legal precedent and general consensus. This unity was, however, partially replaced by a separate ideology of universal rule, substantiated through descent from the world conqueror Chinggis Khan. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the prestige of Chinggis Khan and his descendants effectively buttressed universal claims to sovereignty over large parts of Eurasia. By the middle of the 14th century, these claims began to break down in Islamic lands as well, and this breakdown is the second major event. Before these events, universalizing political authority was most effectively articulated with recourse to juridical and genealogical discourses that buttressed Abbasid and Chinggisid claims to universal rule. So in terms of juridical discourses, I'm referring to the jurists' theories of the caliphate articulated by Muslims, and then with respect to the Chinggisid tradition, I'm referring to dynastic law, or the Yasa of Chinggis Khan, which provided a sort of legal tradition that buttressed his descendants' claims. Both the caliphate and Chinggisid rule were also buttressed by strong genealogical discourses that defined caliphal authority through membership in the Quraysh tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, or in terms of descent from Chinggis Khan. Significantly, neither Timur nor his descendants, nor indeed any of the major rulers of the 15th century, including the Ottomans, were of Qurayshi or Chinggis Khani lineage. In the place of these juridically conceived or genealogically construed claims, Timur and his descendants pointed to the historical fact of his success, his vast conquests, as a sign of cosmic or divine favor. He became the Sahib Quran, the cosmically ordained conqueror of the world. It is this shift from discourses underpinned by juridical or genealogical arguments to alternative discourses supported by astrological, cosmological, or theosophical Sufi epistemologies that characterize the new Timurid vocabulary of sovereignty. So whether we discuss Sahib Quran, Mujaddid, or a theosophical definition of the caliphate, the common characteristics of these terms are their universal applicability. Any individual can theoretically lay claim to them, and their claims to universal authority. This is rule on the grandest scale because the terms suggest an ordering of the cosmos in world historical proportions. The expression of this new vocabulary of sovereignty found its greatest medium in Persian historical writing. Persian historical writing was an exceptional medium for this message because it was so malleable. Modern scholars have surveyed the characteristics of this style during this period and described it as the chancery style. In the words of Julie Scott Masemi, the chancery style was marked by a poeticization of prose. In parallel with this development, the chancery style sought to bolster the didactic credentials of its narratives by interpolating quotations from a variety of authoritative sources, the Quran, Hadith, Proverbs, poetry, and other bodies of knowledge. In other words, historical writing was malleable because it drew on the widest array of knowledge in the construction and presentation of didactic narratives. For this reason, it was also an ideal medium for experimenting with the alternative epistemologies that underpinned the new approach to rule. And this is actually clearly reflected in the historical record. From the time of Timur's son, Shah Rukh, historians affiliated with one or another Timurid court proclaimed Timur Sahib Piran in their histories, and his descendants as Mujaddid or Khalifa-i Ilahi. Yet these aspects alone cannot explain the spread of this new vocabulary of sovereignty in the 15th century. Its success was also contingent upon a high level of social and cultural cohesion within Islamic lands, an aspect sort of long recognized by historians in the 20th century. This cohesion facilitated the free and effective circulation of people and ideas. While Arabic remained the scholarly medium of exchange, Persian, with respect to poetic prowess and administrative expertise, was almost equally regarded. In fact, in non-religious written forms, it was probably the prestige language across a wide geography that stretched from the Balkans to North India. And in this respect, Persian scholars, panegyrists, chroniclers, and secretaries had ample opportunity to circulate among princely and royal courts that valued their administrative expertise in Persian. The phenomenon is clearly discernible in the 15th century, by means of which we may trace the spread of a Timurid vocabulary from the courts of Timur's descendants to ever more disparate polities by following the transfer or movement of officials and their letters, epistles, panegyrics, and chronicles. Indeed, in the 15th century, we should certainly locate the Ottomans within this broader Persianate cultural zone. In the tumultuous decades before and after 1500, a great many learned men left Iran and sought refuge and professional security at the Ottoman court. Some of these refugees offered their skills within the Ottoman chancery, by means of which they helped shape the ideological trajectory of the Ottoman Sultanate. In the time remaining, I'll focus on 3 or 4 of these figures, most of whom are entirely unknown to modern historians. Even so, their experiences, and in fact their mixed legacy, I believe demonstrate something of the possibilities and limits afforded by the circulation of people and the use of hyperliterate Persian as a language of culture, precisely at a moment when the boundaries of Ottoman imperial cultural identity are taking shape. Aside from being relatively unknown, the first 2 figures also shared one other thing in common. They arrived at the Ottoman court in the wake of their capture on the battlefield. The first of these figures was Maulana Munshi, who, along with a great many learned Persian scholars and courtiers in the service of the Akkuyunlu Sultanate, fell prisoner to the Ottomans in the wake of the Battle of Otlukbeli in 1473. According to BBC, Maulana Munshi and the other captives stayed among the Ottomans for many years, where, quote, they were gratified in the shadow of royal favor through various gifts and displays of largesse. Most of them arrived at a high and exalted position. We'll examine that a little bit later. And witnessed such patronage and care in this generous Ottoman court as had never been seen. That is to say, they were valued by the Ottomans for the skills and expertise they offered. In exchange for such generosity, Maulana Munshi contributed to shaping the Ottoman Sultan's image through the composition of royal diplomatic correspondence in Persian. For the remaining years of Mehmed II's reign, and well into the reign of his successor, Bayezid II, Maulana Munshi penned for these two sultans at least 14 royal letters destined for foreign courts. Through his work in the chancery, he had a distinct impact on the tastes and approach of Ottoman secretaries for several generations. His collection of prose writing in Shah circulated in his own day, and several of the most prominent Ottoman literateurs of the 16th and 17th century positively referenced his epistolary skill or carefully copied his example. The impact of the second prisoner come secretary was equally pronounced in his own day. This was Abdülkabir Latifi Qazizadeh, who fell captive to the Ottomans at Chaldiran in 1514. After a short spell as a prisoner, Qazizadeh was freed and permitted to join the secretaries of the Royal Council. In this capacity, he accompanied Selim on his conquest of Syria and Egypt. During these campaigns, Qazizadeh composed victory proclamations in Persian destined for foreign courts, and while in Syria, he conducted the first Ottoman surveys of the financial resources of the newly conquered territory. Most significantly, Qazizadeh was an active writer and translator. In the aftermath of Selim's campaigns, he completed a detailed history of the Sultan's conquests that exhibited all of the hallmarks of the Persian chancery style. The account was highly detailed, but it was also filled with the ideological discourses and the vocabulary of sovereignty that were commonplace among 15th century Persian histories. And I've included here one page from that manuscript. And it's quite interesting because it includes, sort of highlighted here, clear elements of the Timurid vocabulary, but it also demonstrates something of the integration between kind of discourses on rule and narrative. So here's the section starting with how Ottoman administration gets started in Syria after the conquests, and it actually begins with a discourse on what are the requirements of the caliph and what he should be doing. So you can see clearly a kind of integration of narrative, discourse, and these elements of the vocabulary just on a single page of the manuscript. Although largely unknown to modern historians, this work was influential in its own day. The literary approach and monumental subject matter inspired two of Qazizadeh's Persian compatriots to take up the task of celebrating Selim's conquests, and in this manner contributed directly to the development of what is so-called the Selim-name genre of Ottoman historical writing. And these are historical works that focus on the life and career of the conquering Ottoman Sultan Selim. One of these two early Selim-name writers was Bidlisi, and he's in fact the third figure that I will discuss. Bidlisi offers a kind of unique window into all of these processes because he actually wrote so much, and so much of what he wrote remains. So here, is a letter in his hand, which is in the Topkapi Palace. It's a report that he's writing to Selim during the period of these conquests, describing how he's trying to recruit the Kurds. But then also in the manuscript libraries of Süleymaniye in Istanbul, a great number of the manuscript copies of his massive history are preserved, produced in his own day, and in fact, with marginal notations in his hand. So by studying him, you can sort of get a very good idea of the development of these ideas over a 10-year period. You can connect them with his actual work through archival material, and it's a kind of marvelous window into, actually the political and religious and cultural life of this quite important moment. In contrast to Maulana Munshi and Qazizadeh, Bidlisi arrived in Ottoman lands voluntarily. Between his early adulthood and middle age, he worked within the chancery of the Akkoyunlu Sultanate, where he rose to the prominent rank of state secretary. In 1502, after the rise of Shah Ismail, Bidlisi sought refuge at the Ottoman court. Once there, he proposed to Bayezid II to write a history of the Ottoman dynasty worthy of the deeds of its rulers and in the appropriate style. And he's actually explicit on this point. The proposal was accepted, and Bidlisi, in a short time, composed a massive chronicle of the Ottoman dynasty up to his own day, entitled Hasht Bihisht, or the Eight Paradises, and this is a reference to the 8 sultans of the Ottoman dynasty up to the early 16th century. The work was envisioned as a major ideological component of Bayezid's late reign. During the production of the work, Bitlissi drew on the full resources of the court, who maintained him comfortably, provided him with several scribes, and upon